Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome back to New Books in Law, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm Jane Richards, and today I'm pleased to have on the show Dr. Sean R. Roberts to talk about his book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority. Dr. Sean R. Roberts is an associate professor in the practice of international affairs and the director of international development studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He's done extensive research on the Uyghur people in the People's Republic of China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, as well as in Central Asia and Turkey. He's also worked extensively in international development. He first visited Central Asia as a high school exchange student and then returned a few years later to do fieldwork for his dissertation. But I shall let him tell you a little bit more about that if he would like to. Today we're here to talk about his latest book, published last year by Princeton University Press. It is The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority. Sean, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, just to get us started, can you tell me a little bit about how you came to write The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority?
Yeah, I had set about to write a book about how the global war on terror had impacted Uyghurs. This had been an issue that had been of interest to me since 2002, when the U.S. recognized an otherwise unknown group in Afghanistan, a group of Uyghurs, as a terrorist organization. And I'd been following it ever since then. I'd written a couple things about it, and I decided that I should set about writing a book about it. However, the situation for the Uyghurs inside China changed dramatically as I started writing the book. So it inevitably also became very much about how the present situation has come about.
Right. And so then, given the present situation, what do we know about what's been happening in the Uyghur homeland during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we haven't gotten a lot of information directly out of the region. One of the things that's happened is in the run up to the pandemic, there had been actually quite a few very good international journalists who were covering this issue, and they would be able to at least get out to the Xinjiang region and poke around a bit. However, since the pandemic, the region has been mostly cut off. We do get periodically information from essentially government sources about what's happening. And I think, to characterize what's been happening since the pandemic started, I would say that the kind of policies that predated the pandemic have been increasingly consolidated, and what we see is also a transition to a coerced labor scheme in the region that has displaced scores and thousands of Uyghurs from their kind of home villages and so on. And but really this crisis has been going on since 2017, so it definitely predates the pandemic.
Right, that's really interesting. So given this sort of context that, the region is cut off, and I read in your book also that you've been blacklisted by the PRC, I just want to find out how you actually came to do the research, because it was quite interesting.
I've been, I've been studying Uyghurs for almost 30 years. And one of the things I found is that wherever Uyghurs move, they set up their own communities. So it's actually, I'm an anthropologist by training, and I find it very easy to work in Uyghur communities because, for one, they're interested in the world hearing their story, and also, they have very tight-knit communities that are easy to locate. So, I initially, when I was writing my dissertation, I was mostly doing my field research in Kazakhstan across the border, and I would occasionally, like once or twice a year, go over to the Chinese side of the border for about a month and travel around. But I would never interview people inside China, because even at that time, which was in the mid to late 90s, it was dangerous to interview people inside China, because the authorities could get a hold of the recordings and people could suffer serious consequences for that. Um, However, there were lots of people going back and forth across the border, and I was able to interview a lot of Uyghurs who were from China, were Chinese citizens, and were spending time in Central Asia, mostly doing trading, visiting relatives, and so on. That community has been largely cut off since the late 1990s, and increasingly, when Uyghurs are able to leave the country, they try to go to Turkey, which has thus far kind of had a track record of not extraditing Uyghurs back to China, and generally welcoming them, giving them at least, if not citizenship, residential permits and so on. So a lot of the research I did around this book, it gathers information that I've been collecting for years. But some of the more recent material that I gathered was through interviews in Turkey.
And I think, yeah, the information in the book is really detailed, and it's obvious, as you've collected extensively all this sort of data and interviews, and it's super fascinating. I think that's something really interesting about it. So then, I guess, just taking a step back, can you tell me who the Uyghur people are?
Yeah, the Uyghur people are a Central Asian people. They speak a Turkic language. Their homeland, essentially, that they identify as their homeland, is the northwest part of China that's presently called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. But they really have much more in common culturally, and in other respects historically, with the people of Central Asia. So their language, for example, is mutually intelligible with the Uzbek language, and they share a lot of the same cultural traditions. And it's in the modern period, in particular, um, in the beginning of the 20th century, it starts to become much more closely associated with modern China. But even at that time, there's a lot of influence from Central Asia, and you have a lot of influence from the Soviet Union. In fact, in the early to mid 20th century, and it's really only after the Chinese Revolution and the Chinese Communist Party coming to power that the area is decisively kind of controlled inside the Chinese state.
Right. And so I guess this is a good point to talk about. You wrote one of the first chapters in the book was on colonialism, the period you described from 1759 to 2001. And in that part, you write that modern China's relationship with the Uyghurs and their homeland has always been and continues to be one best characterized as colonial. Can you give a bit of an overview of the colonializing process of the Uyghur region in this period between 1759 up until 2000?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've found that since I've written the book, people are more freely accepting of this concept. But for a long time, I think it's true throughout the social sciences and in history as well. Colonialism has always been associated with European empires that colonized non-European lands. However, you really see in a lot of instances elsewhere in the world very similar processes. And I think, one of the things that's kind of testimony to this is that um, since the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we see that indigenous people, who are essentially seen as the victims of colonialism, have included people from all over the world. And China is no exception. Although China does not recognize that it ever colonized other parts of its present territory. In fact, it's quite adamant. The Chinese government's quite adamant at saying that this area had always been part of China. But if you look at the history, the region had been very much a crossroads of empires. There had been some empires that were founded in the region throughout history, and there at occasion there were empires centered in China. In other occasions, they were centered in Iran, and so on. But in the mid 18th century, the Qing Empire, which is the last of the Chinese empires, although it was in effect run by Manchus, who had conquered China, they conquered this region and for about 100 years ruled over it, but really more as kind of a dependency, is what one historian has called it. It was very loosely ruled over. They allowed essentially the local elites to run everyday life, and they would take tribute from the region. And they also put in troops and so on to secure the border and ensure that there were not any kinds of expeditions coming from the West to invade China. And then in the 1860s, there's a major rebellion in the area that essentially kicks the Qing Empire out. And they kind of, I think they had somewhat of a ambiguous relationship with this region anyways. There had been debates about whether it was too expensive to maintain as part of the empire. It was essentially kind of a losing proposition for them. But they come back in the 1880s to retake the region. And at that time, they really try to make it more solidly a part of the empire, a part of what is emerging as modern China. And part of that effort also includes really the first attempts at assimilating the local population to Chinese culture, and in particular, kind of to Confucian culture and Chinese language. And that takes place, from the 1880s until the fall of the empire in 1911. And during this time, the region still continues to the local population still continues to interact with Muslims across the borders in Central Asia, elsewhere. It continues to have, kind of its own traditions, and in fact, the kind of assimilation mission mostly fails. But nonetheless, it is at this time that the empire officially names the region as Xinjiang, which literally means new frontier, which gives you an idea of kind of the tenuous relationship this region had to China historically. And then during the Republican era, which is, after the fall of the last empire in China, there's a period where China is kind of emerging as a nation state, and it inherits the borders of the Qing Empire. But in Xinjiang in particular, it only really loosely controls the region. and there's Han governors who are kind of running it as their own kind of principality. And they're all very different in their orientation. Some of them are highly corrupt and are just interested in lining their pockets. Other ones are somewhat interested in integrating this region into China proper. Um, One of them is actually most interested in integrating the region into the Soviet Union, and allegedly even suggested that to Stalin at one point. So, all this time up to the founding of the People's Republic of China, the region has this very kind of loose relationship with China itself. And that may be one of the reasons that the state today is so adamant about trying to say it's always been part of China, that they feel that to a certain extent there's I think a sense of insecurity about that claim.
And that's really interesting. So there was a high point in Uyghur self-determination prior to 1949 that you write about as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. There actually are two instances during the Republican period between 1911 and 1949, where Uyghurs succeed in establishing kind of regional independent states. The first one happens in the south of the region and is really an indigenously created movement. It has a lot of different influences, and it calls itself the Eastern Turkestan Republic, recognizing that the people of the region don't only include Uyghurs, but other Turkic people as well. And that one gets quickly dismantled by the warlord who was controlling the region at the time. So it lasts from 1933 to 1934. But the second state also calls itself the Eastern Turkestan Republic, and it's established in 1944 with assistance from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union eventually establishes a treaty between the Soviet Union never openly said that it supported this rebellion, but it's been documented since that it certainly did. But when China accuses it of supporting this rebellion, the Soviet Union says, "Well, we'll broker a treaty between the local rebels and the Chinese state," which they do. And there's actually for a short period a coalition government that includes the people from the Soviet-backed state, all local populations, Uyghurs and other local Muslim peoples, and the Guomindang. But the Guomindang also employs some Uyghur intellectuals. So there's a moment in the between 1946 and 49 where you really have Uyghurs controlling their destiny more than any time in the modern period. And I often think of that period as um, a period, kind of an alternative reality. If things had remained like that, would we have a very different situation? Would you have maybe even the ability for this region to, comfortably coexist as part of China, but on its own terms? And unfortunately, that doesn't happen. But I do see that moment in history as incredibly important for the Uyghurs and their desire to have more agency over the land that they see as their homeland.
And then so there are a few turning points that followed that. Firstly, in 1949, with the founding of the People's Republic of China, and then the Cultural Revolution. Um, and then there was a shift as well between 1980 up to 2001. Can you talk a little bit about these just to contextualize, especially what's been going on in the last 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I do in the book, and I think this was very much influenced by my research into development and indigenous peoples. Um, one of the things I do is I try to look at what would have been situations where you would have had a very kind of amicable cohabitation of the indigenous population and the Chinese government. Because in a lot of other instances where you have indigenous peoples, there's different forms of kind of limited sovereignty, recognition of past wrongs, recognition of their ownership of the land, even if it doesn't necessarily come with complete control, at least partial control, and that's kind of a process you continue to see in a post-colonial situation. Um, and I was kind of looking when I was analyzing the history to see if there were moments in the history of this region and its relationship with China where it almost became a post-colonial reality. And I found, several of these moments where things could have gone in a completely different direction. The initial one is right after the Communist Party takes over power in China. One of the things that the Chinese Communist Party is very influenced by the Soviet Union at this time, and the Soviets had established kind of a means of recognizing the excesses of Russian colonialism that predated it, and even in a way framing the Bolshevik Revolution as an anti-colonial revolution. Um, and so, in the Soviet Union, you had these Soviet republics that represented different nations, and even though they weren't empowered in terms of self rule, there at least was kind of a recognition that these people were the native peoples of these different regions, that these were nations in themselves, that they had been colonized, and that the Soviet Union wanted to allow them to express their culture and, of course, doing so in a way that was in concert with Soviet ideology, right? And so, China initially looks at this model and adopts it to a certain degree, and it's partly, I think, out of necessity because in 1949 there's only about 6% of the population in this region that are Han. So the majority of the population is from the local nationalities, and so initially the Communist Party takes on a lot of the Uyghur intellectuals who had led the Second Eastern Turkestan Republic, and brings them on as members of the Chinese Communist Party, gives them positions in the government. And in 1955, the party actually recognizes this region as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And this, is kind of a nod to this idea that this is their land, this is their homeland. But unlike the Soviet Union, they don't have a stipulation in the Constitution that these autonomous regions could actually secede from China, which the Soviet Union did have for its republics. And this moment, I think, quickly recedes when you have the anti-rightist campaign of late 1950s, which in this region essentially targets Uyghur intellectuals and government officials as being nationalists. And then you have a break with the Soviet Union, and China decides that it's going to have its own system that's not modeled on that in the Soviet Union. In fact, feels the Soviet model is inferior, and as a result, I would say by the end of the 50s, that idea of any sort of um, even partial self governance in the region disappears. Um, and the next period is right after the Cultural Revolution. And right after the Cultural Revolution in the 1980s, China is undergoing all kinds of experiments with liberal ideas, in terms of the economy, in terms of opening up space to discuss things, even discussions of whether its political system should be liberalized. Um, and during this period, there's a real kind of cultural renaissance in the Uyghur region because the local people are able to explore religion again. Mosques are reopened. Former religious scholars are allowed out of jail, and the same thing happens in the intellectual realm. You have former professors who'd been jailed as nationalists are allowed out of jail, and they begin publishing again. There's a really robust Uyghur publishing community at this time, and you have, although you don't have uh, kind of standard histories, you have a lot of historical novels that allow them to even explore these periods where they had independent proto states in the early 20th century. And that starts to come apart, already, I'd say in 1987, as you start to have hardliners kind of putting a cap on some of the liberalism that the party was experimenting with. But then definitely after um, the Tiananmen Square incidents, when the student democracy protesters are put down violently. And after that, you really see a shrinking of the political space everywhere in China, but in particular in this region. And then finally, I think the one additional point that's really important to make is um, at the right around the same time, in 1991, the Soviet Union falls, and the Chinese Communist Party essentially identifies the failure of the Soviet Union and its fall with its system of ethnic autonomy, and decides that now China really needs to make sure that there are not movements to have independent states in its autonomous regions in Xinjiang, and also in Tibet, and even in Mongolia.
Mm. And then, so in the early 2000s, you write about how the PRC harnessed then the global war against terror to classify the Uyghur people as a terrorist threat. So, how were the Uyghurs then branded this so called terrorist threat in this period?
Well, I think it's instructive to look at it from the 1990s, from this
Mm-hmm.
period where the party is very concerned about self determination movements. And this was understandable because, as I said, the Uyghur people are very closely related to the Central Asian people, and Uyghurs were looking across the border and seeing that in Central Asia, um, people had their own independent states. And at that time when I was traveling a lot in the region, I would talk to Uyghurs, and they would mention why don't we have our own state? And maybe we will someday. Um, and that became kind of an obsessive target for the government that was searching out for what they called at that time separatists. So they were looking for any signs of a movement for independence. And even though you had a lot of people who expressed kind of the sentiment that I mentioned, it would be nice to have our own state, and people, subsequently using kind of everyday forms of resistance to make that point, but you did not really have any sort of consolidated independence movement, let alone one that had access to arms to kind of launch any sort of threat to the state and its territorial integrity. So I think when 9/11 happens, the Chinese government looks at the situation and it essentially says, well, this would be a lot easier to market essentially globally, because there was a lot of criticism of their mistreatment of Uyghurs in the 90s. If we're able to link this idea of Uyghur separatists to international terrorism. And so they put out some documents initially that are kind of fantastical, talking about how virtually every Uyghur diaspora organization that's doing advocacy abroad is actually linked with Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And there's not much international appetite for this narrative. I think that the United States, to a certain degree, in their meetings with the Chinese government, kind of pushes back on it and says, well, no, the problem in Xinjiang is not about terrorism, it's about human rights and religious freedom and these kinds of issues. But then suddenly the United States completely changes its tune, and in the summer of 2002 actually recognizes one Uyghur group, allegedly in Afghanistan, as a terrorist organization. And they also help the Chinese government get that organization recognized on the UN Security Council consolidated list. Um, and and I think that was a very important thing in terms of, well, it had long lasting influence on Uyghurs. I mean, and it wasn't that it changed policies inside China towards Uyghurs immediately in a way that was perceptible, but it set the precedent to do so going forward.
That's a really interesting point. And one thing you do talk about in the book, just to sort of pick apart what you've just said, is this definition of terrorism. And there seems to be a different conception in Western liberal democracies of terrorism to how it's interpreted in the PRC, if I'm correct in interpreting your work. Can you expand on this a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my book, I have kind of an implicit critique of the war on terror, because I felt that, having lived through that as an adult,
Yeah.
the kind of dawn of the war on terror, and working with Muslim populations in Central Asia, I realized how it quickly became this racialized campaign against Muslims. But one of the things I didn't realize until I started looking at the issue in more depth for the book was the fact that there is no international consensus on what constitutes a terrorist or terrorism. And yet, for almost 20 years, the U.S. has been at war with terrorism. And I found this kind of mind-boggling that more people are not kind of up in arms about the fact that we're at war with something that doesn't have an international definition. Each country kind of defines it their own way, but one of the reasons there isn't an international definition is that it is a very politicized concept that historically states have used to brand non-state actors as potentially dangerous, criminalized, and so on. And I think that in this case, in terms of the global war on terror, which we don't really call it that anymore, but I still call it that because I think it hasn't really ever ended. It becomes very racialized and focused on Muslims. I remember the early period of the global war on terror, there was discussion about whether groups like the IRA should be the Irish Republican Army, whether they should be classified on this terrorist list. Were they going to be one of the groups that this global war on terror was going to be against? And then it became quite clear after not too long that this was only reserved for terrorists or non-state actor, militant non-state actors who are Muslim. And I think that has allowed all kinds of countries to abuse the ambiguity in the definition. You can essentially brand any Muslim group that you are opposed to as a terrorist group, and can subsequently get away with suspending their human rights. And I think that that's what happened eventually to the Uyghur people. And I think there's other examples that people can point to of other groups that have undergone similar kind of manipulation. The Rohingya, different groups in northern Africa, and also even in Muslim majority countries, it became something that they could use to brand their political opposition, and that was the case for some time in Central Asia. So I think that's it's a very serious issue, I think, with our kind of counterterrorism campaigning that creates any number of dilemmas, I think, for us in terms of human rights. And I don't think it's been something that has been dealt with enough by the international community. And we haven't really reckoned with this problem. And I think it still continues to be a problem. In some ways, it's just kind of festering and getting worse.
And so then, considering the ongoing and intensification of repression and oppression of the Uyghur people by the PRC government, has there been any evidence of any kind of terrorist threat?
Well, so, I mean, it depends on what you call a terrorist threat, of course.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I think that what I found is I didn't find any evidence of kind of a concerted, organized, militant movement. What does happen is that by 2013, a lot of because things get increasingly worse for Uyghurs in the second decade of the 2000s. And that has to do with some other things that happened. In particular, there was essentially a race riot that took place in the city of Urumqi that quickly, escalated into violence on both sides. Uyghurs going after Han, and Han going after Uyghurs. And the Uyghurs were essentially blamed for this. And even though it was very evidently had nothing to do with terrorism, the government identified this as an act of terrorism. And so as a result, things got very, very bad after 2009. And by 2013, the tension in the region starts turning into violent acts that look, and I think, can be defined as terrorist acts, but they're not necessarily having to do anything with Al Qaeda or an organized threat. And one of the things that helps facilitate this narrative as well is that at the same time there is this one Uyghur jihadist group that had very little capacity to carry out any kind of violence inside China, but became a very prolific maker of videos, and they were continually making videos about any violent acts that took place in the Uyghur region, and essentially congratulating the people of the region for standing up to the Chinese and waging a jihad. And it's one of these instances where presumably these people thought they were helping their countrymen, but they were essentially giving just another excuse for the government to say that there was a serious terrorist threat. And that and you start to see, as a result, by 2013-14, maybe 4 or 5 acts of violence that look to be terrorism by my definition, which means that they're politically motivated, premeditated acts of violence with a political goal that attack civilians.
And then this
But
provided
I
the
don't think it necessarily makes a terrorist threat.
Right. And then so this sort of provided some justification for the so-called People's War on Terror from 2014 to 2016. Can you talk a little bit about, from 2014 under Xi Jinping, what happened in the Uyghur region?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do think that things got much, much worse under Xi Jinping. And I mean, this is something a lot of people are suggesting is true across the board in China. In terms of civil liberties and so on. That under Xi Jinping, the situation has gotten increasingly dire. And some of the things that happened, that essentially that time period of Xi Jinping coming to power is the same time period that you start seeing some of these acts of violence allegedly carried out by Uyghurs that look like terrorist acts. And there's one in particular in 2014 when Xi Jinping takes his first trip to the region, and just about when he's going to leave, there's a bomb that goes off at the Urumqi train station. Urumqi is the capital city of the region, and that's kind of when he decides we need to have this people's war on terror. And one of the things I found in my research when I looked at this period in depth, you could kind of see that all the things that the state has put in motion since 2017 have their origins during this People's War on Terror. The state establishes what they call extremification regulations, which basically provide a way to categorize what qualifies as extremist in terms of behavior, right? Because this is one of another, I think, problem in terms of the war on terror, and particularly as it moved to a discourse of countering violent extremism, is often people are not looking at what people have done, but what they think, and that's always a dangerous kind of transition when you start getting into thought police. And these regulations lay out essentially any kind of encouraging people to adopt a religion, refusing the hand in marriage to somebody of a different religion or ethnic group, wearing certain clothes. These are all considered signs of extremism, and these things are all the things that eventually they start interning people for. But already in 2014, you start to see this implemented to a certain extent in certain places, and in particular in the South, the Uyghur majority South. And we also see the state experimenting with different forms of re-education. And they believe that first they have to identify the extremists and then re-educate them so they're not extremists, and they're loyal citizens and they understand their wrong ways. Um, and all of these things. Oh, and finally, the other piece of the puzzle that's put into motion after 2014 is the mass electronic surveillance, and in particular, the creation of a database that allows the state and security organs to essentially collate, a digital file on any given Uyghur individual that can easily be rated as loyal or disloyal or neutral. And these are all the things that have been used since 2017 to essentially target the entire Uyghur population.
It sounds like some kind of dystopian future. It almost, sounds made up. It's quite frightening. So then I'm glad you came to this point. So you write in 2017 that prior to 2017, Uyghurs were subjected to frequent violations of their human rights, faced discrimination on the basis of their identity, and were pressured to assimilate and restricted in their ability to practice their religion. But their identity did not face complete eradication. This situation changed over the course of 2017 as their PRC began a systematic and violent dismantling of Uyghur culture and indemnity that can be unequivocally described as cultural genocide. So, can you talk about what happened in 2017 that caused this shift, and what are some of the key ways that cultural genocide has been perpetrated?
Yeah, I think it's unclear why the shift happens. I look at that period in depth to try to get a sense. There's a couple kind of minor violent incidents that take place. But I kind of came to the conclusion that since the government was putting these kind of the pieces of the puzzle in place already in 2014, that at some time between 2014 and 2017, they decided that, this was going to have to be an all of population campaign. And Xi Jinping puts a person in control of the Uyghur region as the head of the regional party, Chen Quanguo, who had been the party secretary in Tibet prior to this. And he had already there implemented a lot of security measures, including these kind of checkpoint slash small police stations dotting the entire urban landscape, in particular in urban places, that were called convenient police stations. And so he puts those in place. But obviously, somebody puts forward the order to build these mass internment camps. And I think we don't really know yet, who exactly decides to do that, but you'd have to imagine that it comes from the central government because it's a massive undertaking and expensive undertaking, and they build these mass internment camps throughout the Uyghur region, and then people start disappearing. Um, and that's when people from outside started to notice that something very wrong was going on in this region. Myself knowing Uyghurs in the U.S. And elsewhere who are telling me they can't talk to their family members anymore. They don't know what happened to them. Um, and also, there's a couple of researchers who start uncovering the procurement documents for these internment camps. There's another, actually, a law student in Canada who is from China. Starts just using Google Earth and starts noticing all of these new internment centers and maps them out. And there's people in Kazakhstan who are starting to encounter people who've entered into these camps and are able to give eyewitness testimony. Um, but I think that what I try to note in my book, and I think it's an important point, is even though these internment camps, for a whole host of reasons, are the most headline grabbing part of this. I mean, they're very evocative of genocides past and so on. They're only part of what's happening, and they're a central part of it. The other central part is the mass surveillance system, because those two things taken together ensure that everybody outside of internment camps or prisons, because at the same time we have this massive spike in people arrested and sent to actual prisons in 2017. Um, Everybody outside these penal institutions who is being constantly surveilled must be complicit in everything the state is doing or otherwise face either imprisonment or internment. And so you get this situation where any sort of resistance, soft or hard, is almost impossible. Um, and the state starts basically transforming this region. It starts, displacing Uyghurs from traditional villages, developing these villages into different things, remaking the landscape in terms of mosques, changing their appearance, repurposing them, closing them, destroying them, destroying pilgrimage sites, and accompanying that with a strong campaign to essentially assimilate Uyghurs to Chinese culture, and including making sure everybody speaks Chinese, making sure that children are only able to speak Chinese from kindergarten on in school. A lot of parent separation from children because of the internment and imprisonment, and also this coerced labor system that brings a lot of other parents out of the picture because they're sent to residential factories and are part of work groups that are all over China. And all of this, to me, is much more reminiscent of the fate of indigenous peoples in settler colonies like the United States, Canada, Australia, and so on. Even some of the methods, boarding schools, different attempts to essentially break the solidarity of the indigenous peoples to make sure that they can't resist the development and settlement of this region. And as a result, I really believe that the intent of the Chinese government all along has been to develop this region into an integral part of China. And in that equation, the indigenous people are at best superfluous and at worst an obstacle that must be removed. And that's what we're seeing now. And I think that the terrorism narrative has served as a convenient kind of justification for all of that, but it's not really what it's not the core reason for what is happening.
Right. And so, in this context, you describe the ongoing resistance against the erasure and displacement of Uyghur culture as futile, both from a cultural and a human aspect. Can you expand a little bit what you mean by this, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for Uyghurs outside of China, it's not futile.
Mm.
But inside China, it becomes futile because the state has put in all the apparatuses to severely punish anyone who does not comply with all of their wishes. Whether that means indefinite and extra legal internment, whether that means, essentially imprisonment on very questionable charges about somebody being an extremist, um, or whether that is being sent to work units, in residential factories, and isolated from the rest of the factory's population, and at the same time continuing to be given re-education. So it'll be interesting. I mean, it'll be interesting to know what kinds. I mean, I think that there has to be some resistance
Mhm.
happening, but what that looks like, we may not know. Uh, for several years until some people get out of the region who've undergone all of these things. We have right now some people who have provided testimony who are survivors, but there's very few Uyghurs getting out now. Um, and the point is that even if you can resist, but you will immediately be destroyed if you do.
Mhm. Right. So, in conclusion, you asked three critical questions as to the future trajectory for the Uyghur peoples and their homeland. Now, I'm hoping you can answer these now. Firstly, I want to know what you see as a logical conclusion of the cultural genocide against the Uyghur people. And I'm also interested to know, in this context, what you think the Biden administration should do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the second question relates to, you say that the global war on terror has never really been about terrorism. It's always been about finding a justification for the pursuance of other interests. So, what are the implications of this, and what do you describe as a tragedy in relation to the global war on terror? And finally, what can be done to stop the Uyghur crisis from getting any worse?
Oh, some big questions there. All right. So, to start with, what is the logical conclusion of the cultural genocide? I paint a very bleak picture in the book, which I hope is not inevitable. But I paint it as a means of saying, if nothing is done to stop this, this is where it's headed. So I mean, essentially, um, breaking the will of these people, significantly depopulating them. Since I wrote the book, there's been a lot of evidence coming out about sterilization campaigns, and even the official state statistics shows that there's been like a 50% um, reduction in births among in the region actually since 2017, and assuming that this sterilization is only targeting the local Muslim populations and not the Han, that would mean an even more significant reduction in births among Uyghurs and other indigenous Muslim peoples. And essentially, marginalizing them on the margins of society, which is what you see has been done to so many other indigenous peoples around the world, the Native Americans, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, and so on. And I think it doesn't end in the complete destruction of the peoples. It's more the pacification, and the peoples can be reborn subsequently, but they suffer incredible trauma that makes that rebirth very difficult. And in terms of what can be done, and in particular what the Biden administration should do, I feel that this is a problem that can only be resolved by the Chinese government, right? I mean, there's nobody's going to go to war over this issue with China, because nobody wants to go to war with China. Nobody wants another world war. Um, and so the question is, how can you get the Chinese government to change its behavior? And I think the only way you can really do that is through economic pain. And the truth of it is that for the rest of the world to exert that kind of pain on China, it's also going to be painful for the rest of the world, because our global economy, we're so intertwined that there it's going to be a burden for American consumers and American producers to essentially cut away from their reliance on China. And this is all the more problematic because what we see with the coerced labor programs is it's been spread throughout the country, and so people have documented that factories that provide parts, they're parts of supply chains to major corporations, are entangled in this coerced labor. And I see that right now. I think one of the most positive developments is that in the U.S. Congress there is an act called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that would basically stipulate that any products that have any Uyghur coerced labor in their supply chain will not be allowed into the United States. And they put the burden on the corporations to figure that out and to prove that this is the case. I mean, it would be a difficult law to enforce, but it could be done, and it could, I think, really show a lot of important people in China that what the state is doing to the Uyghur people is not in their best interest. Um, I think that Xi Jinping can't turn around and apologize to the Uyghurs, because he's already essentially gone all in on this strategy and this policy. I would see it being about powerful people who could perhaps pressure him to step down, and then he and his government could be blamed for this, and then there might be an opportunity for reconciliation. But you know that's kind of beyond my capacities. I'm not a political scientist to know really how that's going to happen, but I think that the economic pressures are really the thing that could change the situation. And my hope is that there's still enough interested economic forces in China that would put pressure on the state to change course if they realized it was hurting them economically. Um, and then in terms of the war on terror, I feel like there needs to be an end to the war on terror. Um, Now, in the United States, this is problematic because as long as there's a war on terror, the executive has this very fungible power to use the armed forces in different contexts, as long as it's construed as seeking out terrorists. Um, but I think it's important, and I do feel like it's perhaps an opportunity to press the international community to come to a consensus at the UN as to what defines terrorism, and then being able to kind of loosen the moorings of that to Islam, which is something that's caused this global Islamophobia. I mean, you don't have to look very far if you're in the United States, because really the terrorist threat in the United States right now comes from white supremacist movements, not from Islamic jihadists. So I think having a clear idea of what, and for me, the real defining aspect of terrorism is not the ideas you hold, but it is killing innocent civilians deliberately with a political aim to send a message. And I think that's something that's worthwhile stopping.
Yeah, of course. And I think that just ties in. You conclude with a rather ominous phrasing. You write, first they came for the Uyghurs. So can you explain what you mean? Beyond the complete destruction of Uyghur identity, culture, religion, humanity, is there a concern for the global community of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I the point I wanted to make at the
Mm-hmm.
end, by saying that, was I think that in this crisis, everybody should see foreboding, cautionary tales about things that they could face in the future. Part of that is, I think, the mass surveillance. This is something that is already here. It's something that any state can employ for nefarious purposes, to essentially oppress anybody they want to oppress. I think the technology is all there in every country, pretty much, and this is an instance where the Chinese government is selling their hardware for this. I mean, some of the electronic surveillance equipment essentially racially profiles Uyghurs with facial recognition and voice recognition, so they can immediately target who is and is not a Uyghur. But also, I think there's other issues. I mean, this the issue of rising populism in the world that is very focused on nativist nationalism is something that you can see in this instance. I mean, we've seen it. It's happening all over the world right now, and where politicians are essentially using outsiders, others, as scapegoats to fuel their kind of nationalist agenda. And I think this is a very extreme version of it, but it concerns me that it could set a precedent for seeing that happen elsewhere. And then finally, at a time where we're trying to come to grips with the legacy of colonialism and the destruction it's done to indigenous peoples, this sets a precedent for essentially ignoring the rights of indigenous people and going back to a kind of 19th century idea of progress justifies any kind of destruction. Um, so I see that I see in the Uyghur crisis, a kind of mirror that people looking at it may see different things, but they're all things that are extremely foreboding and worrisome about where the future of the world is headed.
Yeah, it's extremely worrying indeed. Now, Sean, I've taken up a lot of your time, but just before you go, can you tell me what you're working on now?
So right now, I'm doing some stuff around what's happening to Uyghurs right now.
Mm-hmm.
I've
Yeah.
committed to writing a bunch of articles about that from different perspectives, and I've been doing a lot of speaking on it because I feel it's really important. And I've been doing speeches about this in different places. Different universities, different organizations, and so on since 2018 at least. And it still surprises me that every time I do, there's people there who don't realize the scale of what's happening. So obviously, the awareness raising, continues to be important. Um, and then finally, I'm looking at a project that deals with the issues around the war on terror and looking at kind of a comparative frame of three different groups that I think have suffered significantly from the war on terror, and needlessly so. And that's the Uyghurs, the Chechens, and the Uzbeks, who are a very different case, but they're all cases in Eurasia, where I have a degree of local knowledge that I think I can look at the realities and myths about these different terrorist cases and how it's been used to essentially reassert state power against different types of opponents.
Yeah, actually, in preparation for this interview, I did a quick Google on you. And anyone listening at home, if you do Google Sean R. Roberts, you will come up with loads of articles he's written. Yeah, there's so much you can find out about. So, yeah, you've definitely been very busy, and I look forward to hearing more about some of your work. So, just in conclusion, I'm Jane Richards. I've been speaking to Dr. Sean R. Roberts about his latest book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority. This is New Books in Law, a channel on the New Books Network. Sean, thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.